This is the Meetinghouse with Dwight A. Moody. News, reviews, commentary, and conversation on religion and American life. Now, here is Dr. Moody.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm coming to you today from the great state of Tennessee. I've been in Nashville this week, attending the Southern Baptist Convention. The first time I've been to the convention since 1990. That was the year, some of you remember, when 45,000 messengers convened on New Orleans, Louisiana. I must have been in the Superdome. What else could have held us all? That was the final year of the great struggle to control the future and character and soul of that great denomination. My votes were on the losing side, and many of us really left to find a new spiritual home. But the Southern Baptist Convention has continued, but it's been in a lot of trouble. It's been on a sharp decline in membership and sales and many other things. And it made this convention pretty dramatic, which is why I decided to go. I got press credentials. I'm going to report on all of that after my conversation today with the Reverend Stephanie Spellers. And she is canon to the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in America, and an acquaintance of mine since I believe that was 2016, when she accompanied the presiding bishop, Michael Curry, to Lexington, Kentucky, where he preached at the National Festival of Young Preachers back when I was leading the Academy of Preachers. Welcome to the Meetinghouse, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Dwight. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, and you look
Wonderful.
great. You sound good. Where are you today?
I am in North Carolina.
Really?
I'm actually at the first gathering that we've been able to have, kind of a gathering that's really kind of an in-person conference here at Cayuga Camp and Conference Center. And so it feels kind of good because I went to college in North Carolina. And so to now be here, we just had Eucharist, and it was just the biggest blessing to have people gathering in a big circle, like 60 people, but still big circle, and to give thanks to God and to share communion and sing, and it was glorious. So I'm actually in the library here.
And well, I'm on the road too, in a private home, and I just posted a picture on Facebook of the get up I had to stack up in order to create.
Yep, I've got that too. I totally got that.
A broadcast.
I'm checking out my
place.
Angles and everything. I'm like,
I know.
We're good.
Now, the Cayuga Conference Center, what county is that in?
I mean, it's outside of Asheville. So it's western North Carolina. We're here in the mountains. I'm real close to Hendersonville.
Well, I have a studio and an office in Hendersonville, and I do, and normally broadcast from there.
You're kidding. So we could have done, if you were home, we could have done this from your
We could have done it live in my home studio.
Who would have thought?
Who would have thought? So I drove over the mountains through Knoxville over to Nashville to cover this story. Had a wonderful time.
Good. I'm
glad. You're in North Carolina. Where did you go to college? You said in North Carolina?
I went to Wake Forest University.
Oh, really?
Yep. Demon Deacon, 100%.
Amen.
Went to high school in Knoxville, Tennessee, actually. So I know that drive from western North Carolina to East Tennessee. Those are my old stomping grounds, all of it. Even if I live in New York City now, this still feels very, very familiar. Feels like home.
Now, what kind of connections do you have with Kentucky? What do I remember about that?
Kentucky is truly home. Yes. Kentucky is where I grew up, in Frankfort, Kentucky, central Kentucky, the little bitty capital city. Yep. It's where my whole family still is to this day. Yep, my mother, my brother's in East Tennessee, but everybody else in my family is within an hour. Everybody is within 1 hour of Frankfort, Kentucky. And
Well,
then there's me in New York.
you in New York, you've made it to the big time. Well, Kentucky is my home, and I've got three children who live within an hour's drive of Frankfort, two sisters as well, many nephews. So lots of my roots, all of my roots really, are within a couple of hours drive of Frankfort, Kentucky. And soon as I finish the show today, I'm on the road to Owensboro, Kentucky, where my dad is from, and
Owensboro.
yeah.
I love this.
Yeah, so I was a pastor there for 6 years
Mm-hmm.
before I moved to Georgetown and
Yep.
served as professor of religion and dean of the chapel there for a decade. So
Got it.
now tell us, I'm a Baptist, Stephanie. You're going to have to tell me and our listeners, what is a canon? Your title is Canon to the Presiding Bishop. What in the world does
What
this
is a
mean?
canon? So first of all, presiding bishop, maybe I'll start there. Presiding Bishop Michael Curry is the head for the entire Episcopal denomination.
Right.
So Episcopalians, not just in the USA, but actually in I think like 16, 17 other countries, are all a part of the Episcopal Church. And so he's like the Pope in a way for all of us. So I serve as one of his canons. And that means if you think about canon, like what does a canon do? It kind of like fires forth. It goes,
Right.
it sends that like out.
Yeah.
So I say that I, as a canon, am like the ball that goes flying out from the presiding bishop. I serve as an extension of his ministry. So the things that Michael Curry and our whole church hold dear: evangelism, we hold dear racial justice and reconciliation, the care of God's creation, church planting, ethnic ministry, social justice ministries. All of those are part of what I shepherd on the presiding bishop's behalf. So cannons go boom on behalf of a bishop.
You've got a big portfolio, but cannons also explode all over the country and and create excitement and sometimes destruction and all sorts of things. I mean, that image
I've been known to do these things. Without realizing.
We're going to talk about your fabulous book, The Church Cracked Open, in a few minutes, but I want to continue this. Now, the Episcopal Church in America is part of a global Anglican communion.
Amen.
Say just a word about that.
So way back in the day, would have been, I guess, like in the 1400s, King Henry VIII, we know the story, right?
Yeah.
Broke from the Roman Catholic Church and created the Church of England. Out of that Church of England, there are any number of other churches that kind of were founded around the world. And that's the global part of our global communion. So the Episcopal Church is the American expression, but actually we, even based in America, we also have reach into other countries too. But all of us are a part of that Anglican communion. We are all connected through the Archbishop of Canterbury. Maybe you've heard about him, Justin Welby. So we are all connected, and we call them bonds of affection. So it's not that we all have to follow all the same rules. The church in Tanzania isn't supposed to be like the church in Lexington, Kentucky. But we are all in loving relationship with one another, and worshiping Jesus and loving God.
Amen.
Along the Anglican way.
Well, let me ask you now about the Anglican Church of North America. I am part of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which broke away from the Southern Baptist Convention 30 years ago. Something similar has happened in the Episcopal Fellowship. Tell us about that.
So I don't know when the Anglican Church in America, that particular expression, was officially born, but I know that it came out of really a few generations of just disagreement. And for some folks, that disagreement was something that they just could not reconcile. and some of it was around women being ordained.
Hmm.
And but I think the piece that really sealed it for a lot of these folk who left was the ordination, the consecration of a gay
Yes.
bishop who was out and partnered, and
Bishop Robinson
Bishop Gene Robinson. You
from
know it.
Lexington, Kentucky.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gene, come on now.
Yeah, Gene.
Whenever I
Yeah,
see him, I'm like, I know that face. I know that.
the next time you see him, he's
Mhm.
working up at Chautauqua now, isn't he?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
I've been to
spends a lot of
Chautauqua,
time in DC as well.
but
Yeah.
when you see him, you tell him that I am trying to get hold of him to be my guest on the Meeting House,
Ah, yeah, yeah.
to talk about his journey, about Chautauqua.
Hmm.
It's a great place in my life. So, um, well, let me ask you this. You wrote this book, The
Yes.
Church Cracked Open, right? You were writing on it during the pandemic.
Yes. Yeah. I
Now,
I put in the request, or not the proposal to write the book came in June of last year. Like I wrote that proposal in June of last year. So this entire thing was conceived, written, published during pandemic.
well, before we get to the book, how
Hmm.
has the Episcopal Church fared during the pandemic?
Yeah. I mean, my experience is that we've been really careful.
Hmm.
That, we look around and I've talked to some clergy and leaders who are like, other denominations aren't being this careful.
Yeah,
Others are coming together. But we've really said that a part of loving Jesus and loving God and loving our neighbor is protecting our neighbors and protecting one another. And that, when I look at you, I see the face of God. And that means
sure.
I've got to honor that and I want to keep
Hmm.
you safe. So we have been, I think, um, less urgent around getting back into buildings or worshiping in person. But what that's meant is that we've had some extraordinary experiences, Dwight, discovering church outside of the
Hmm.
box.
Yeah, outside of the
So
box.
exactly. So a lot of churches, that never would have had like a screen, for worship would have said, "Oh, that's blasphemy." Any
Yeah.
any digital element in worship is blasphemy. And within a couple of months, those very churches were worshiping online. And I think what we're talking about a lot is really what have been the blessings of this. Um, well, I guess the way I put it is the strange and difficult blessings of
Right.
pandemic. To
Yeah.
say nobody asked for this, we never would have, but now that we've been in this situation, what are the things you actually hope you can keep? What are the things that we've learned and that we've let go of that we don't necessarily need to pick back up again? And so, the attachment to buildings, we've seen churches releasing some of that. The attachment to having the priest nearby in order to make something holy. Priests couldn't go, around any more than anybody else could. So I think people have discovered the holiness of their own homes and families. We've been encouraging small groups,
Boy, that is a great
lots of
title
good
for a
things.
that's a great title for a book. The
Yeah.
holiness of the home.
Yeah.
That is a great idea,
Yeah. And
and
why
a
not
great.
explore that? Because
Why?
because like if we had told people it's time to start house churches and small groups and do things in your homes, they'd been like, no, stop telling us what to do. With COVID, like especially, oh my goodness, like last Easter when we really couldn't be in home or in our buildings. Some figured out how to do Easter together this year, but
Mhm.
last year we were running um, just kind of little tutorials on how to build an altar at home.
I think this
I
is a
hope people
great
never
idea.
forget that.
Many Protestants have resisted the idea of having a sacred spot or an altar at home, or even a sacred art. But now the pandemic, as a matter of fact, one of the most interesting things that I have spoken about to churches is for every home to have its own communion set. I remember when I was at Shaker Village in Pleasant Hill, there south of Lexington. They had a whole wall of these communion. Well, they were bread trays and chalices, I don't think they were designed to be a home communion set, but they function perfectly that way. And now we've been encouraging our people to purchase and have a communion set right in your home. It's one of those.
I have been a somewhat secret fan of practices like that.
Yep.
And what we know is that a lot of folk have been doing that, you know,
Mhm.
but it's, to me, it raises really important questions about the location of holiness, the
Mhm.
power of the Spirit. And my belief is that if Jesus could do all that we say he's done, including rise from the dead, then surely the Holy Spirit can figure out how to travel through fiber optic cables in order to make holy what a priest has not touched.
Well, I have been, as you might imagine, conversing in the meeting house with pastors the whole year,
Yeah,
talking about these things
yeah,
and talking about what's going to remain and what's going to continue, and how seriously to take your digital congregation. People who may not ever darken the door of your church, but want to participate through digital means.
hmm.
How do you think that's going to impact what you're doing in the Episcopal Church?
I hope it doesn't end. Um, I hear folks talking a lot about how we want to maintain those relationships,
Mm-hmm.
the validity of those relationships. There are a lot of churches, I think, that started out doing digital worship thinking it would be for a time. And
Right,
now they're saying, they're like, oh, this will just be a part of how we
right,
worship. That there are
right.
families who travel a lot or who can't get to worship at a particular time, um, who finally could during this period. There are older folks who wanted long desperately to be back in community, and now they can be. There are newcomers who wanted to just kind of like sneak in the back door and check things out, but were too wounded by church to make their way in the door
Right,
physically.
right.
They could make their way through a digital door. So I'm excited by how many leaders I see saying this is going to stick around. This will just we'll just be doing worship in person and digitally, and giving thanks to God for this opportunity to get this way of gathering and practicing evangelism.
But Stephanie, there's another book title, The Digital Door.
Ooh,
You
who's going to
could write a
write
whole
this,
book.
Dwight?
Well, you and I could write it together. How
There
about
you
that?
go. Okay,
I'm
cool.
actually consulting with a church that's looking for a minister to their digital congregation.
We created a training for digital greeters.
Really?
Yeah, and that was one of our, we've learned a lot, and tried to share what we're learning and to pass things along to other folks. But that was one of the things we did early on, was encourage churches to figure out how to have digital greeters.
Now,
And, it's like,
where could I find this information? Is it on the website of the
yeah,
church?
if you go to episcopalchurch.org/evangelism, there are a number of kind of toolkits that we have on that website. And we've got kits for digital worship, digital greeting, cool stuff like that. Yeah, episcopalchurch.org/evangelism.
Now, you wrote this book, The Church Cracked Open. I
Hmm.
read it and reviewed it. People
And
can
I
read my
appreciated that. Yeah.
my review at themeetinghouse.net under the review page. Cracked Open. Tell us, I know you describe this in the book, but tell us
Yeah.
where you got this image, this metaphor.
Oh boy. I wish I were on my laptop Zoom, because I have a Zoom background that's an icon of the woman who barges into, this dinner that the men are having.
Hmm.
And she comes in with her jar of oil, the alabaster jar. We know this woman. We love this woman.
Right, right.
And to me, that image of that alabaster jar, that she doesn't drop it, she doesn't just pour it out. She cracks it open. She takes that jar and she breaks it open in the midst of this gathering, disrupts everything. um, And in the process, she releases this healing oil. She releases what had been trapped in the jar, held in the jar, beautiful jar. But the only way that oil was going to get out and heal the way it was supposed to was if it was broken open. And one of the things that came to me very clearly this has actually been something I felt for a long time, but especially during the pandemic, is that, wait a minute, we're now like, this pandemic has pushed us out of our church buildings. It's pushed us away from our safety spaces, our rituals that were very conscripted. Um, and basically, it's broken the jar. The jar is broken. But now, it's kind of what we were talking about with digital worship and other things right now. Now, actually, the oil can flow. It can get to where it was supposed to go all along. It was never about the jar. It was about what was in the jar. But we've been
There's
worshiping
another
the
phrase.
jar.
It was never about the jar. That's a great sermon title right there.
Yes, it was
It
never
was
about the
never
jar.
about the jar.
But everybody was worshiping the jar and talking about how precious the jar was, how precious the building was, how precious particular rituals and traditions were, instead of talking about the Spirit of God and how do we participate in the release of the Spirit into the world.
If I remember
So,
right, the men rebuked the woman, didn't they?
indeed. Well, most of the men did. Jesus said to her, "You will be remembered
Yep,
for
that's
what you
right.
have done here." So the
And here we
men,
are. And here we
and here
are,
we are remembering her,
remembering.
remembering that, wow, when those pieces, the other thing I love about that image, Dwight, is that all those pieces on the ground, kind of like the pieces of our churches. And I love the idea of pausing for a moment and instead of trying to reassemble the jar as quickly as possible, get church back to whatever it was before, why not look at those pieces and discern together what are the pieces that need to come back and what is the thing that we need to rebuild? Because, and this is the other part of my book, white supremacy, racism, classism, and empire are so interwoven so embedded in the lives of our churches that dismantling racism, dismantling empire in the life of church is really hard work. You kind of have to dismantle church itself. Guess what? It's happened.
It's happening.
Now that church has been
Well,
dismantled, can we identify what was the fruit, what were the signs of white supremacy and racism and empire, and say, we're not putting that back. We're not going to put back, like, as long as we're out of the building, why not go ahead and check out those stained glass windows that you haven't looked at in a year and a half anyway?
mhm,
The stained glass
mhm,
windows of a blonde-haired,
mhm.
blue-eyed Jesus, and replace those windows. Why not replace other images? Why not use this time to examine, like, what are the power differentials that we have assumed about in our worship and just in our common life? And, why not say, actually, we're going to share more now, share power more, because we've had to. Why not keep doing that?
About a year ago, or maybe a little longer, I took a tour of our church
Mm,
under the direction of our children's minister, and we looked at every piece of art in the
mm,
building, curriculum, baptismal art, framed art, all of it with this thought in mind. What
yep,
image of Jesus
yes,
are we putting out there with the art that we're using? It's a
yeah,
very powerful tour that people need to have of their stained
mhm,
glass and their baptistries and their Sunday school rooms and the
right, right.
hallways.
And to all of those images, like, Dwight, I'm looking at you, and you look so much like the images of God in our churches.
Yeah,
Like, why is that? Why does God, like, 80, 90% of the time look like you?
yeah, yeah.
Like, and just to say, like, that's not actually to remind people, you realize God doesn't look like this, right? But if you looked at our iconography, you would think that we knew what God looks like, and that God is this, this distinguished, but relaxed and friendly look, but some, white man. Um, we know
It's a great
better. We know better.
it's a great opportunity for churches to sponsor and host art festivals with the purpose of creating a whole new collection of art for their buildings. What kind of art should we be making now? Our children, our young people. I have a son who's an artist, and so I'm very keen on using art as a ministry tool and as a teaching tool, and trying to reconceive Christian art away from the kind of standardized images that certainly I grew up with.
And I did too. We all did.
We all did. Now, I was very taken, as you might recall from my my review, about how you write in your book about the long, complicated, and sometimes disgusting history of the Episcopal Church. You call it the chaplain to the empire. What a great phrase. Not all good news. Talk to us about this.
I mean, of course, most of the churches in America have some story with, if not empire, some story with white supremacy and racism. We've all been impacted. Even even churches that are majority people of color have still been somehow, we still live in conversation with white supremacy and racism and empire. But the Episcopal Church, because we were the church planted by the Church of England, because we were the church planted by the colonial powers, there's a way that we were called, were equipped, and were charged to tend the things of empire, to tend the people, to protect and to chaplain, and to pray for the king, and then the other governors, to pray for and to guard on behalf of the powers that be. That's been our role since before there was an America, and even after the Revolutionary Wars. I love this story. I remember reading in Episcopal Church history. A lot of people are like, "Oh, but when our church was officially founded, when we broke from England, and then in 1789, I think, was when we, or in the 1780s at least, when we officially founded the Episcopal Church, and said we are not the Church of England anymore. We are the church. We are a church in America." And we instituted a lot of democratic processes that were not the case in England. And yet we still were serving the group of people who had power, who had kind of that Anglo-American identity. And that was the group who wrote the Constitution. That was the group who served as the first Supreme Court justices. That was the group, who owned more slaves. Oh my goodness, the figures will just, it really will just break your heart.
I know.
Right, that we're the church who made the case for slavery as a Christian institution.
Well, of course,
because so many of our folk were slaveholders.
And of course, the Baptists followed right in your footsteps. The Southern Baptists created in 1845, wanted to be the chaplains to the Confederacy. They were all slave owners. They defended. So what you all did influenced the Baptists in the South. We, not that we hold you accountable for that, but because it's our own history. But, I wrote in my review, I was so impressed by your willingness to go back through your own church history and write frankly about it. I said in my review that every denomination and tradition needs their own version of this book. The church cracked open. The Baptist church cracked open, and the Methodist church cracked open, and the Presbyterian church, and even the Pentecostal church cracked open.
Everybody's got something, because in most of our cases, especially for Protestants, most of our Protestant communities are segregated.
Yes.
And we've taken it for granted. It is still the most segregated hour, Sunday morning at 10 or whatever that time is still the most segregated hour in American life. And we just assume that that's the case. We assume that it's about preference, that it's just, they don't like the music we like. And our culture, our church culture is this and this, without being honest. We're not being honest, Dwight, about the fact that, no, it's that your church doesn't reflect the ways of God. Your church reflects your preferences, your culture.
Oh, the ways of
And
God.
yeah, and that because churches are not following Jesus, but instead, we're not creating disciples of Jesus. We are creating disciples of particular cultures.
Yes.
And in this
Yeah.
case, in many cases, and certainly in the Episcopal Church, it's disciples of whiteness. And whenever I say that, folk kind of freak out. I'm like, I'm just showing you what's here. Like if you read through our prayer book, oh, the language is beautiful, it's wonderful. And it's so much language directed to, it's as if only people in power are doing the praying. And we're always praying for those unfortunate souls out there somewhere,
Out there somewhere. Yeah.
as if they're not members or leaders in our own churches, because in the Episcopal Church, people who've had less money and less education haven't been a part of our churches. And our church is a bookish church, and not just a bookish church, but it's a church of high literacy, high education,
Right.
and when you try to question that, folk really get upset. And my thing
Yeah.
is, you realize again that like God speaks in many ways, but we've gotten so attached to a particular cultural expression as if that is the voice of God, and that's heresy, that's idolatry, and that's part of what has to get cracked open.
Well, in your book, I remember I went back and read my review. I failed to bring a copy of the book with me on my trip over the mountains, but
I have it on my phone.
you've got it right there. You laid out a very practical plan for church renewal. And this is what I wrote. I want to quote from my review, quote,
Nice.
1 billion people won't read this book. And that's a reference to the famous Michael Curry sermon, at the wedding. And that's unfortunate. Were that to happen, it would trigger revival, renewal, reformation, and renaissance all at once, not just in the Christian community, but of the whole human race. That's because there is a wideness to the vision of Reverend Spellers and a winsomeness as well, full of hope and insight and practical direction. End quote. That's what I wrote about it.
Woo! You were so kind.
So describe briefly the practical plan that you laid out that so impressed me, and I think will impress others.
You bet. Well, in the Episcopal Church, we've been coming face to face for some time now with the fact that we've been discipling people to a particular culture, and not necessarily making disciples of Christ.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, something that we introduced about 3 years ago is called the Way of Love, and it's a rule of life. It's what monastics and other, Christians on the path with Jesus have been following for centuries. So we created this rule, and so I brought that rule into the conversation with Church Cracked Open, and the idea that followers of Jesus are to lose our lives in order to gain real life, right? That's what he tells us over and over again.
That sounds like
And
Jesus.
then to walk in love. In other words, to truly live as disciples. And that especially if we want to live counter to empire, counter to white supremacy, counter to just self-centrism. Let's be honest, like a human thing that we just do that Jesus tries to help us to break out of is to place ourselves at the center and then organize everything else around us, as if everything rotates or revolves around our small selves or our small culture, our small church, our small denomination, our small nation. So what I look at is these 7 practices of a rule of life, and how if we follow them, each of these practices helps us to get more aligned with Jesus and less aligned with empire. So for instance, the practice of turning, which is really just the practice of examining your life. It's confession, it's repentance, but turning toward Jesus again and again, regularly. Imagine if we could be that honest in our regular everyday lives and have a practice of saying, I'm sorry, Jesus, I'm sorry, God. And if we could do that as a nation, right now we're talking about reparations and things like that. One of the hardest things for people to imagine is saying, I'm sorry. Why is that? So turning, growing humble before God and saying, I want to follow you, Jesus. That's a practice that is counter to empire. Learning. And for us, that means learning the ways of Jesus in Scripture. So if we want to be disciples, disciples are those who learn. So we go to Scripture and we learn the ways of Jesus. And then we can pattern our lives after his. If I'm not rooted in the Word of God, how am I supposed to follow Jesus? And yet
Amen.
I feel like a lot of folk, we kind of make it up and we make up things that make us feel better instead of actually looking at what he says. So learn is a practice that gets you more in line with Jesus. Pray. Jesus spent so much of his life praying. And what he did really was he oriented himself so he was constantly dwelling in the presence of God. Do we orient our lives to be constantly in the presence of God? Or do we put God in a box? And do we actively dwell with God and invite God to actively dwell with us? If we do, that's what prayer is. And if we do that, it makes all the difference. Worship. Worship especially is a counter-empire practice, because in worship, we are placing God at the center and taking ourselves and other structures and powers out of the center. We're saying, God, you are first. I'm not going to worship my nation even. I'm not going to worship my own lifestyle. I'm not going to worship my thoughts. I'm not going to worship whatever. I'm worshiping you, God. If we put God at the center, a lot of other things would get reoriented and we would be able to be aligned with Jesus. Another of the practices is blessing. Imagine if we lived our lives for others. That's all blessing is. Blessing is giving your life away for others. So that practice of blessing, oh my God, I've seen so many people living that practice during pandemic. And
Yeah.
imagine if we just kept on going with giving our lives away. First responders embodied for us how to do that. But we can all do that. And when we do, we are living like Jesus. And then going across boundaries and borders in order to participate in justice. That's not just some side venture. Justice work, healing, and remaking creation in partnership with God is a part of how we live like Jesus.
Stephanie, do you have what strikes me? You may already have a practical guidebook.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have something
For the way of
that's
love?
yes, for the way of love?
Oh, honey, we have, so again, episcopalchurch.org.
I
And this
see.
time, go to, actually, just even on our landing page, if you just go to episcopalchurch.org/way of love,
Way of
there
love.
are so many resources
I
that
see. Okay.
Episcopalians have been creating and following,
Good.
videos, small group curricula. We're about to do a new series. We've got stuff for children, for people alone, so much.
Well,
So
good,
much.
because I was about to give you another book idea about how to do all this, but you're already doing it.
We've
But
actually written it, a few of them. Yeah.
I read on your Facebook post this morning
Mm-hmm.
that you're revising one of your books and reissuing it.
Yes.
So take a minute and tell us about this book.
Well, this is my first book. It's called Radical Welcome. And Radical
Radical Welcome.
Welcome, yeah, it's about the practice of embracing God, the God that we meet in others, and especially in the other, the one who is usually on the margins of our
Mhm.
church's lives. So Radical Welcome is about actually extending ourselves so that we enter into mutual relationship with people who are usually on the bottom.
Mhm.
And again, it's not just welcome, it's not just the practice of hospitality, but it's really looking at what are the things that our churches have been doing that made it impossible for a lot of groups, people of color, young people, um, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered people, poor people, at least in my church, um, people with disabilities, so many folk who feel like that sign
Yeah.
that says the church welcomes you,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
see an invisible sign underneath
Yeah.
that says, but not you.
But not you. That's a
Yeah.
great statement.
Yeah.
And
We need to take that sign away.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Stephanie, it's just great to talk with you about your book and to feel coming through this Zoom like connection we have your energy, your spirituality, your hope, your optimism, your courage. Thank you for what you're doing. Give my regards to your boss. I remember very much his sermon he preached, The Dream of God. I remember the title and everything in Lexington. I hope our paths cross again real soon.
Oh, sorry, Dwight.
Yeah, there you go.
There we go. I was just attempting to take it off mute. There's some talking going on behind me.
I can hear it.
I look forward to more conversation, and offer blessing to you and to
Thank you.
all of our Baptist and Baptist brothers and sisters, but also just everybody in this human family of God. Thank you for gathering us in.
And the next time you come to the mountains of North Carolina, I hope I'm home and can host you there. So,
And I hope we can have some pulled pork.
blessings on you. This
be
is the
with you.
Meetinghouse, where we have wonderful conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. I'll be back in just a minute with my report of the Southern Baptist Convention this week in Nashville, Tennessee. This is the Meetinghouse, and I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. I traveled to Nashville, Tennessee this week to attend the annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention. It's the first time since 1990 that I attended the Southern Baptist Convention. One of the things that made this trip memorable was not something that happened in the convention hall, but at the end of my first day there, I left, the hall about 4 o'clock to find my car. I thought I knew right where it was, but I didn't. I spent 90 minutes walking all around the Music City Center in hot weather, trying to find my car in some parking lot. I came very close twice, I found out later, but I finally found it. And actually, the next day, went exactly to that same spot and parked again. I want to give you some highlights of the Southern Baptist Convention. It's important because it's the largest denomination in the United States. It's also had an enormous amount of political influence, especially, strangely enough, during the Trump years. But here are some highlights. Vision. The executive committee, which is the lead committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, proposed a fresh set of organizational goals called Vision 2025. Very predictable: more missionaries, more baptism, more churches, more ministers, more money. But then from the floor came a motion to amend it and add a sixth goal, quote, to eliminate all incidences of sexual abuse and racial discrimination among our churches, end quote. Tall order, but at least it brought to the convention from the floor the two real issues facing Southern Baptists today. Second, the president. They elect a president every year, and most of the times they serve for 2 years. This year, Alabama pastor Ed Litton was elected president of the Southern Baptist Convention. He won only 52% of the vote in a runoff against Georgia pastor Mike Stone. Eliminated in the first round of voting were 2 SBC employees, Seminary President Al Moeller of Louisville and State Convention Executive Randy Adams of the American Northwest. Litton has been active in efforts to seek racial reconciliation. I'll have more to say about him in just a minute. You can see from the picture that I met him and exchanged greetings and cards. Proposals. The SBC surprisingly defeated a major rewrite of another proposal from the executive committee, namely one that defines the mission and ministries of Lifeway Christian Resources, the publishing arm of the convention. One provision of that revision was to move their student ministry or collegiate ministry from Lifeway to the North American Mission Board, but it was defeated. And that defeat left another proposal moot. Stunning setbacks for the leadership of the executive committee, and it's not over. The next item, sexual abuse. Besides the addition to the Vision 2025 statement, which I spoke about a minute ago, the Southern Baptist Convention empowered the new president, this Ed Litton, to create a task force to oversee the investigation of the powerful executive committee. They are to take oversight away from the executive committee itself, which wanted to oversee the examination or investigation of itself. Boy, if that's not a conflict of interest, then I don't know what is. This investigation will focus on how the executive committee handled its response to sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention, especially as it was brought to the fore in the hashtag #MeToo movement of 2018. Many of you will remember the role that Beth Moore played in publicizing this and how disgusted she was in the indifference of the executive committee to the concerns of men and women all over the Southern Baptist Convention. She ended up leaving the Southern Baptist Convention over this. So more on the executive committee. This most powerful agency in the SBC network, led by a pastor by the name of Ronnie Floyd, suffered setback after setback during this convention. As mentioned above, Vision 2025 was amended in a substantive way. Its proposal to change the mission assignment of the North American Mission Board and Lifeway Publishing was rejected. Its efforts to accrue to itself more control over convention money and convention agencies and institutions was soundly defeated. And its pre-convention effort to oversee an outside investigation of its own operations was defeated. If I can quote another book, it was a terrible, no good, very bad week for the executive committee. And many people now are calling for the resignation of Reverend Floyd, its executive. We'll see what happens. And then resolutions. The SBC 2021 adopted a series of resolutions, including those against abortion, of course, actually 2 of them, sexual abuse, in which they called for excluding permanently any person who is convicted of sexual abuse, individual and systemic racism, and against the Equality Act, which is something that's working its way in through the House and Senate in Washington. 2 resolutions mourn the Uyghur genocide in Myanmar and those killed by the COVID. But interestingly enough, the resolution on COVID failed to encourage the people to be vaccinated. I think that reflects the politicization of the vaccination. How people in the South, especially of a Republican bent, suspect evil in the vaccination protocol. The resolution committee received proposals from at least 1,299 people. Amazing. All of their names were listed in the daily bulletin. And I want to say this about the chairman of the resolutions committee. His name is Dr. James Merritt, a longtime friend of mine. We were colleagues together in doctoral work many years ago, but he was my guest in the Meetinghouse about 6 or 7 weeks ago. That's when he told me then that he was the chair of the resolutions committee. And I want to commend him publicly now for a job very well done. He said it was the last time he was ever going to chair a committee. He was president of the convention about 20 years ago. And finally, the big deal at the Southern Baptist Convention, critical race theory, CRT for short. It was prominent, perhaps the most prominent issue in the Southern Baptist Convention. People were wearing stickers that said no CRT. 2 presidential candidates, Al Mohler and Mike Allen, both of them defeated, made this a central plank in their campaign. The resolution on race, however, approved by the convention, it was actually a first approved in 1995. They just brought the same one back in approved. The reason it is important is that it mentions both and refers to both individual and systemic racism. That's very important. That little line in that resolution did not receive the attention that it should have because it was a pushback to CRT opponents who contend that there's no such thing as systemic racism. The only kind of racism there is individual racism. As a matter of fact, they go to the extreme to say there's only one kind of sin, and that's individual sin. There's no such thing as social sin or systemic sin. I had a long conversation about this with a Texas pastor, young, articulate, intelligent Texas pastor. I had lunch on Tuesday. I was surprised at how adamant he was. Finally, there is the press coverage. Not since the great fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention 40 years ago have Southern Baptists received such extensive coverage by the secular press. The Atlantic, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, all of the television networks, just about every metropolitan newspaper in America published stories about the Southern Baptist Convention. Of course, the Religion News Service, the Christian Post, Roy's Report, all had multiple stories. And, of course, at the front of the list, front of the line, the Meetinghouse. I want to give a shout out to Baptist Press, especially its manager, John Wilkie. They gave me press credentials, welcomed me warmly, helped me throughout all of it. I got the warmest, most positive email, a message from John this morning telling me how glad he was that I was there. I want to publicly commend him. He managed the press conference. I was sitting on the back row, but it was the first time I'd ever been to a press conference. Sitting next to me in the press room all week was Ruth Graham, another famous name person, writing for the New York Times. Her articles appeared on the front page of the New York Times both Sunday and Monday, and I think on Wednesday. I met and talked with Brian Taylor of the Word and Way, the Baptist paper in Missouri, and I also met, in fact, is the first person I met in the press room, aside from the receptionist, was a man by the name of Chris Moody, Moody, writing for the New York Magazine. You can find his article online. Chris Moody is the grandson of the famous Jess Moody, the preacher at the First Baptist Church of Owensboro many years ago, First Baptist Church of Van Nuys, California, then the First Baptist Church of West Palm Beach, where he founded Palm Beach Atlantic University, PBA it's known. My sister at one time was on the faculty there. My son attended PBA and played basketball there. I've been there many times. Their longtime pastor, Paul Courts, is a friend. I want to thank all of these reporters and the press people. It made for a great week. In my own coverage of it, which I sent out Wednesday, I have an article called The Better Angels. You can read that at the meetinghouse.net. But I also published my own version of Vision 2025. 5 things I think Southern Baptists need to do with their own mission and witness to have a more powerful, more relevant, more significant witness in these United States. I'm going to come back and summarize that for you in just a minute. You're listening to The Meetinghouse. I'm your host, Dwight Moody, coming to you over Rejoice Radio in the Golden Isles of Georgia and through the television network of St. Stephen's Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. I will be back in just a minute. This is the Meetinghouse. I'm Dwight A. Moody, your host, here with my version of Vision 2025 for the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, I haven't been a Southern Baptist since 1990, but I care about what happens there. I have many friends and former students. I met and talked with 2 of my students. One of them even took me to lunch. So I care about what happens there. Here they are. The Executive Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention presented a plan to address both the statistical decline of the denomination and the ugly infighting, what I called in my article Baptist bitchiness. It's known as Recommendation 10 in the annual book of reports, but their proposal is depressingly predictable. More missionaries, more congregations, more ministers, more baptisms, more money. I mean, the kinds of things that organizations always write about. When it was presented, as I reported, a motion was made from the floor to add a sixth goal to eliminate all incidences of sexual abuse and racial discrimination among the church. That proposal was met with enthusiasm and was passed immediately. Because it addresses the real concerns of Southern Baptist people, which are also some of the reasons why the denomination is in such precipitous decline. They have failed to respond properly to charges of sexual abuse, to adequately integrate women into the leadership of the denomination, and to address the systemic racism prevalent within and throughout the American South, especially in its churches. I have my own proposal of what they need to do over the next 5 years. Here's they are. Number one, elect a black man as president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. There's no black person elected to lead any agency or institution of the Southern Baptist Convention. Yes, there is a black man who is the chairman of the powerful executive committee that took such a beating this week. And yes, a black minister is currently executive director of the Maryland-Delaware State Convention. I heard him preach this week. These are big steps forwards, but now Southern Baptists have an opportunity to put a black man in charge of an agency. That'll be a real test. The ERLC presidency is open because Russell Moore just resigned under pressure, mostly because he was a never Trumpster. Now it's time for them to tap a talented black minister to lead this agency. Number two, elect a woman as president of the SBC. I know ordination is too much to ask, as is it's the top spot in any seminary or agency. But the presidency is a temporary position, generally for 1 to 2 years. It does not require ordination or even a ministry background. It requires intelligence, competency, and commitment to SBC causes, and there are plenty of women who measure up. This would be a signal, a powerful public signal that so many Southern Baptist women long to see. Number three, create an office, perhaps within the ERLC, to implement the sixth goal of the recently approved vision statement about sexual abuse and racial discrimination. Some administrative structure will have to be created somewhere to give oversight and energy to this goal. The strategic plan covers only 4 years as I read it, and it will take that long to create this office and get its staff funded and operating. But something has to happen before it's too late. Number four, send on an overseas mission trip every year at least one of these persons serving as either a seminary president or an agency executive. The Southern Baptist Convention is about global missions. They know that, or at least that's what they say. But the sad fact is that none, not one, of the men who currently lead these agencies and institutions have spent any time overseas in a ministry assignment, except maybe as a summer missionary. That is a sad fact, perhaps for the first time in the history of the Southern Baptist Convention. So it's time for them, one by one, to be sent on a rotating basis overseas. Some people will say it's not practical. These entities cannot function without a top executive. But, you know, anytime there's a vacancy, they function for months and months at a time with no executive. They do just fine. Number five, take up an offering and give it away. Southern Baptists have been good at raising money. They've raised billions for missions and proud of it. They've raised millions for endowments. They're stronger for it. But all of these offerings are about their own budgets, their own buildings, their own organizations. In other words, they give money to themselves. But the gospel is about giving things away, about investing resources in other people. and other organizations and other missions. So here's a practical way. Create an annual offering, call on the churches to give, and then empower them to give it away. All of it, every penny of it. Give it to the homeless. Give it to homeless shelters. Give it to food banks. Give it to some organization that they don't have control of. So here they are: install a black man, elect a woman, open an office, send an executive, give an offering. Those are my 5 ideas from the Meetinghouse. Thank you for listening today. It's been a great program. Thank you for Stephanie Spellers, to my 2 engineers, Alex Mattingly, Everett Armstrong down in Georgia. Thank you for listening and watching today. Join us next week. My guest will be Tom Krottenmacher of New Haven, Connecticut, the religion writer for USA Today newspaper. From the Meetinghouse, I'm Dwight A. Moody. Have a great day.
You have been in the Meetinghouse with host Dwight A. Moody. Thank you for watching or listening today. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net for more news, reviews, commentaries, and conversation on religion and American life.